The rain fell in sheets, a cold, gray curtain that seemed determined to wash the last bit of color from the faded facade of the corner spoon. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, grease, and quiet desperation. Clara moved through it like a ghost, her worn-out sneakers making no sound on the cracked linoleum. At 42, she felt 100. The lines around her eyes weren't from laughter. They were etchings of worry, carved by sleepless nights and a grief that had settled deep in her bones. She wiped down a table, the damp rag smearing the condensation, her reflection a pale, blurred version of a woman she barely recognized anymore. A customer, a portly man in a cheap suit, shoved his plate forward, the half-eaten stack of pancakes swimming in a pool of syrup. "This is cold," he snapped, his voice loud enough to make heads turn. "And the coffee's burnt. What kind of a joint is this?" Clara's apology was automatic, a smooth, worn stone of a phrase she had used 1,000 times. "I'm very sorry, sir. I can get you a fresh cup." He waved a dismissive hand. "Forget it." He threw a few crumpled bills on the table, deliberately short of the total, and lumbered out, letting the door slam behind him. The other patrons, the usual collection of early morning regulars, looked down into their mugs, their silence a form of judgment. They saw a tired waitress in a threadbare uniform, an easy target for a man's bad mood. They didn't see the eviction notice tucked inside her apron pocket, its sharp edges a constant, painful reminder of the cliff's edge she was standing on. They didn't see the woman who worked 16-hour days, fueled by little more than weak coffee and the fading memory of a promise she'd made to her late husband. Her boss, a perpetually sweating man named Gus who was more accountant than cook, shouted from the kitchen pass-through. "Clara, table 4 is complaining. Again. You gotta smile more, honey." "It's not that hard," she didn't respond, just gathered the dirty dishes. Her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. The humiliation was a physical thing, a sour taste at the back of her throat. It wasn't just the customer or Gus. It was the suffocating weight of being invisible, of being seen as nothing more than a function, a pair of hands to deliver coffee and clear plates. Her existence had been whittled down to this, a series of small daily degradations in a world that had long since stopped noticing she was there. She carried the dishes to the kitchen, the clatter a small, sharp sound in the oppressive quiet of her life. The rain beat against the window, relentless and cold, and for a terrifying moment, Clara felt like it was washing her away, too. The jingle of the bell above the door announced an arrival that curdled the already sour atmosphere in the diner. Mr. Silas stood there, shaking water from his expensive trench coat onto the worn welcome mat. He was a man built of soft flesh and hard angles, his smile a predatory slickness that never reached his small, calculating eyes. He owned the building, the diner, the small apartment upstairs where Clara lived, and he seemed to believe he owned a piece of her, too. He ignored the counter and slid into a booth, his gaze fixed on Clara. "Coffee," he said, not a request but a command. Gus shuffled out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Morning, Mr. Silas." The usual. Silas didn't look at him. His eyes followed Clara as she poured the coffee, her hand trembling just enough to make the cup rattle in its saucer. "And bring the ledger," he added, his voice dropping. "I want to see yesterday's take." Clara placed the coffee before him, keeping her eyes down. "Gus has the ledger, Mr. Silas." "I'm not talking to Gus." His voice was a low growl. He waited until she was trapped between the booth and the wall, her path blocked by his bulk. The smell of his cheap, cloying cologne filled her senses, making it hard to breathe. "The rent was due Tuesday, Clara," she flinched, the words a physical blow. "I know. I just need a few more days. I'll have it by Friday. I promise." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes roaming over her, making her feel as if her thin uniform were dissolving under his gaze. "Promises don't pay the mortgage," he said softly, a cruel intimacy in his tone. "But you and we could come to an arrangement. A more personal payment plan." The suggestion hung in the air, thick and foul. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and rage. She could feel the stares of the other customers, the sudden, intense interest in the dregs of their coffee cups. They heard, they knew, and they did nothing. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was firm. "I'll have your money on Friday," he laughed. A short, ugly sound. "Suit yourself. But Friday at noon. The money is on my desk, or your pathetic little collection of memories is on the sidewalk. Your choice." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "And don't think Gus will save you. He can barely afford his own lease. You're all alone in this, sweetheart." He patted her arm with a clammy hand, a gesture of ownership that made her skin crawl. He pushed past her then, heading to the counter to harass Gus about the numbers, leaving Clara standing there, shaking and exposed. The humiliation was no longer a quiet, internal thing. It was a public spectacle. Silas had stripped away her dignity in front of everyone, and their collective silence was the final nail. She was worthless, disposable, a problem to be solved with money or submission. The world had presented its terms, and she had nothing left to bargain with. Clara fled to the relative sanctuary of the staff break room, a space no bigger than a closet, smelling of bleach and old cigarettes. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of her locker, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She fumbled with the small lock, her fingers clumsy and numb, and pulled the door open. Taped to the inside was a single photograph, its corners soft and curled with age. It was of her and Mark, taken 5 years ago on a sunny afternoon in the park. He had his arm around her, his smile wide and genuine, crinkling the corners of his kind eyes. He was wearing his favorite worn flannel shirt, and she was laughing, her head thrown back, a look of pure, uncomplicated joy on her face. A woman she no longer was. Mark was the architect of her quiet strength, the bedrock of her principles. He had been a carpenter, a man who believed in building things that last: houses, relationships, a person's character. "You never take the easy way, Clara," he used to say, his hands, calloused and strong, holding hers. "You take the right way. Even when it's the hardest." The right way had become a path of thorns after the accident. A scaffolding collapse, a freak occurrence, the lawyers had called it. For Clara, it was the end of the world. He hadn't just left her with a heart shattered into a million pieces. He'd left her with a mountain of medical bills and the debts from his fledgling construction business. The insurance covered almost nothing. She had sold their small house, the one he had been so proud of renovating with his own 2 hands. She sold her car, his truck, their furniture, piece by painful piece, until all that was left were the contents of a few cardboard boxes and this single photograph. She had promised him, in the sterile silence of the hospital room as his life ebbed away, that she would be okay, that she would live with honor. She hadn't known then how much that promise would cost her. It was that promise that made her refuse Silas's vile offer. It was Mark's memory that kept her from crumbling. Giving in to Silas wouldn't just be a physical violation. It would be a betrayal of everything Mark had stood for, everything they had built together. It would be an admission that his values, their values, were worthless in the face of brute, ugly reality. She traced the outline of his face in the photograph, her fingertip lingering on his smile. The grief was a constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened into stabbing pain at moments like this. But beneath the grief was something else, something hard and unyielding. It was the resilience he had seen in her, the strength she was now forced to find on her own. She would not break. She would not let a man like Silas tarnish the only thing she had left, her integrity. She closed the locker door, the click of the lock echoing in the small space. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she straightened her uniform, smoothed her apron, and prepared to walk back into the battlefield of the diner. The right way was the hardest way, but it was the only way she knew. The morning rush dwindled, leaving behind a residue of dirty plates and quiet melancholy. The rain outside had intensified, lashing against the large plate glass windows of the diner. Each gust of wind seemed to shake the old building to its foundations. Clara worked on autopilot, refilling salt shakers and wiping down counters, the scene with Silas replaying in her mind on a torturous loop. He had stayed for nearly an hour, nursing his coffee and making pointed remarks just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. He talked about tenants who didn't pay their way, about the importance of knowing one's place. Each word was a carefully aimed dart, and Clara felt them land, one by one. Her coworker, Lily, a timid 19-year-old saving up for community college, avoided her eyes, her fear of Silas more powerful than any impulse of solidarity. The regulars, men and women Clara had served for years, who knew her name and asked about her day, now offered only nervous, fleeting glances. Their silence was a verdict. They saw her predicament not as an injustice to be opposed, but as a misfortune to be avoided, as if her bad luck were contagious. Old Henry, a retired factory worker who ate breakfast at the counter every single day, was the only one who showed a flicker of defiance. He had stared at Silas with open contempt, but he was a frail man in his 80s, and his disapproval was as powerless as a whisper in a storm. The pressure was building inside Clara, a physical weight in her chest. Every tick of the clock on the wall was a countdown to Friday at noon. Where would she get the money? She had nothing left to sell, no one left to ask. The thought of being thrown out onto the street, her few belongings piled on the wet sidewalk for all to see, was a paralyzing terror. It wasn't just about shelter. It was about the final public stripping of her humanity. Silas reappeared from the back office just before noon, a smug look on his face. He didn't approach her this time. Instead, he stood in the middle of the diner, making a show of looking at his watch. "Just a friendly reminder, Clara," he announced to the room at large. "The clock is ticking. End of business today, not Friday." Today he had moved the goalposts. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Today, it was impossible. He knew it was impossible. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was a power play, a deliberate act of cruelty designed to break her. He wanted to see her beg. "Mr. Silas, please," she started, her voice shaking. "That's not what you said. I'm the landlord. I say what I say," he sneered. "End of day. Or you're out." He turned and walked out, the bell on the door sounding a final, mocking peal. The diner was utterly silent. The handful of remaining customers stared at her, their faces a mixture of pity and discomfort. This was it, the precipice. There was no one to catch her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence of her community, a cold, heavy blanket smothering her last ember of hope. The pressure was no longer a threat. It was a certainty, a crushing reality that was about to bring her world crashing down around her. The afternoon bled into a bleak, gray evening. The rain had turned to a freezing sleet that rattled against the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. The diner was nearly empty, the warmth from the kitchen doing little to combat the chill that seemed to seep in through the very walls. Clara was on her official break, though it was a break in name only. She sat in the booth farthest from the door, a small bowl of leftover potato soup and a single, slightly stale roll on the table in front of her. It was her first and only meal of the day, a meager offering she knew had to last. Her stomach was a tight knot of anxiety, hunger a distant, secondary sensation. As she lifted her spoon, the bell on the door jingled, a sound so jarring in the quiet that it made her jump. A man stood there, silhouetted against the churning gray outside. He was huge, a mountain of a man, but he seemed to be collapsing in on himself. He was soaked to the bone, his long, matted hair and thick, untamed beard dripping water onto the floor. His clothes were little more than rags, and he shivered violently, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook his entire frame. He didn't speak, didn't approach the counter. He just moved to the booth across from Clara, sinking onto the vinyl seat with a weary sigh, as if the simple act of walking had taken his last ounce of strength. He wrapped his arms around himself, his eyes, hollowed out by cold and exhaustion, staring blankly at the tabletop. Gus yelled from the kitchen, "Clara! Get him out of here! We're not a shelter." Silas, who had returned to gloat and watch her final hours tick away, smirked from his perch at the counter. "Look what the storm dragged in. Don't you dare give him anything." He's not a paying customer. Clara looked from Silas's sneering face to the shivering man. She saw the raw, brutal misery etched into his features, the blue tinge of his lips, the desperation in the way he huddled for warmth. In his hollow eyes, she saw a reflection of her own despair. He was just as invisible, just as dismissed by the world as she was. He was human and he was freezing. In that moment, her own problems, the rent, the eviction, the crushing weight of her future, seemed to recede. All that existed was the profound, immediate need of the person in front of her. Her own hunger was a dull ache. His was a life-threatening crisis. She looked down at the steaming bowl of soup, the small piece of bread. It was all she had. It was everything. Without a second thought, she picked up her tray. She walked the few steps to his booth and placed the meal in front of him. The soup, the bread, and a glass of water. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. It was a simple, silent act of communion, a sharing of the last crumbs of hope in a world that had offered none. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. The man didn't move for a long moment. He stared at the bowl of soup as if it were an apparition, something his desperate mind had conjured from the cold. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes, which Clara had first seen as hollow, were now startlingly clear and sharp. They were a deep, piercing blue, and they held her gaze with an unnerving intensity. There was no gratitude in them yet, not in the simple, expected sense. Instead, there was a profound, silent assessment, a weighing and measuring of her action that went far beyond the offering of a meal. It was as if he were looking directly into her soul, seeing the sacrifice behind the gesture. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect that felt more meaningful than any words of thanks. He picked up the spoon, his large, chapped hands surprisingly steady, and began to eat. From the counter, Silas let out a bark of derisive laughter. "Well, isn't that just perfect? Saint Clara, feeding the dregs of the earth while she's about to be one of them. You can't even afford your own food, and you're giving it away." "You're a fool." A couple in a nearby booth, who had been watching the exchange, chuckled nervously and quickly paid their bill, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene. Lily, who was refilling napkin dispensers, looked at Clara with wide, pitying eyes, as if she had just witnessed an act of pure madness. But something in the diner's atmosphere had begun to shift. Old Henry, still nursing his coffee at the end of the counter, pushed his cup aside. He looked directly at Silas, his wrinkled face set in a mask of pure disgust. "You, sir," he said, his voice thin but wiry with conviction, "are a disgrace to the human race." Silas's face flushed with anger. "You watch your mouth, old man, or you'll be barred from here." "Wouldn't be a great loss," Henry retorted, his gaze shifting to Clara. He looked at her not with pity, but with a deep, quiet admiration. He saw what Silas couldn't. The immense strength it took to show compassion when you had nothing left to give. The act had polarized the room. It was no longer a space of passive observation. Clara's simple, selfless gesture had drawn a line in the sand. On one side was the cynical cruelty of Silas and the fearful indifference of the majority. On the other was the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to let the world's harshness extinguish her own humanity. The shivering man finished his soup, wiping the bowl clean with the last piece of bread. He didn't speak, but he watched Clara as she went back to her work, his gaze following her with that same intense, assessing quality. A seed of change had been planted. The whispers of judgment were beginning to be drowned out by a murmur of something else, something that sounded almost like respect. The first sound was a low, distant rumble, so deep it was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the soles of Clara's worn shoes. It grew steadily, a guttural growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The few remaining patrons looked up from their plates, their faces etched with confusion and a dawning unease. The sound swelled into a deafening roar, the unmistakable thunder of dozens of V-twin engines, converging on their location. The windows of the corner spoon rattled in their frames, the coffee in the mugs trembling, creating concentric rings on the dark surface. Outside, the sleet-streaked street was suddenly filled with headlights, a swarm of bright, angry eyes cutting through the gloom. One by one, then in a flood, Harley-Davidson motorcycles pulled up, filling every parking space, lining the curb, blocking the street in a formidable, disciplined display of power. They were an army on iron horses. The engines cut out in staggered succession, plunging the diner into a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the frantic beating of Clara's heart. Men dismounted, their large frames clad in worn, road-stained leather. On their backs, the same patch was emblazoned on every vest. A grinning skull, the symbol of the Hells Angels. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was a statement, an overwhelming force of silent intimidation. They moved with a shared purpose, forming a loose perimeter around the diner, their posture relaxed but radiating a coiled tension. The air inside the diner had become thick, heavy with unspoken threat. Silas's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a pale, sweaty fear. Gus peeked out from the kitchen, his eyes wide as saucers. In the booth, the big, shivering man slowly, deliberately, pushed himself to his feet. His movements were no longer weary. They were powerful, imbued with a latent authority. He walked to the door, his wet boots leaving dark prints on the floor. He pulled the door open, and the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet leather and gasoline. The bikers outside parted for him like the sea before Moses. He stood on the threshold for a moment, then turned back to face the room. He nodded toward the men outside, and they began to enter. They filed in silently, filling every available inch of space. They lined the walls, stood between the booths, surrounded the counter. There were at least 30 of them, their collective presence shrinking the small diner, their stony faces and hard eyes scanning every corner, their gazes lingering on a terrified Silas, and then, with a different, unreadable quality, on Clara. The room was now theirs. They had taken it without a single threat, without a single raised voice. The sheer, overwhelming weight of their brotherhood was enough. The balance of power had not just shifted. It had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. The man who had been shivering in the booth now stood in the center of the room, a silent king holding court. The water still dripped from his beard, but he no longer seemed cold or weak. He seemed forged from the storm itself, his presence commanding absolute attention. He looked at Clara, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together, yet it carried to every corner of the silent diner. "My name is Bear," he said, his piercing blue eyes holding hers. "And I owe you my thanks." He then turned his gaze upon the rest of the room, his eyes sweeping over the few remaining customers, Gus in the kitchen doorway, and finally settling, like a physical weight, on the trembling form of Mr. Silas. "I've been on the road for 3 days," Bear continued, his voice calm but laced with a dangerous edge. "No food, no shelter. I lost someone close to me. I was looking for a reason. A sign that this world wasn't completely rotten to the core." His gaze flickered back to Clara. "This woman," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, profound respect, "who I watched being threatened and humiliated, who has every reason to be bitter and cruel, gave me her only meal. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't preach. She just acted. She showed more honor and decency in that one small act than I've seen in a year." A younger biker, his face hard but his eyes sharp with intelligence, stepped forward. He was Bear's second in command, the sergeant-at-arms, his patch denoting his rank. He walked directly up to Silas, who flinched as if he'd been struck. "You run this place?" the biker asked, his voice deceptively soft. Silas could only manage a choked nod. "And you're the one who threatened her? To throw her out on the street?" The biker leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "You have no idea who you've been dealing with. The man you let freeze in your diner? That's not just a brother. That's our captain, the president of this charter. And when you threaten someone under his watch, you threaten all of us." The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't some random vagrant Clara had helped. This was the leader of the most formidable organization in the state. He hadn't been weak. He had been observing. He hadn't been asking for charity. He had been testing the character of the world he found himself in. And in the entire town, in this small, forgotten diner, only one person had passed that test. Clara stood frozen, the bowl she was holding forgotten in her hands. The entire situation felt surreal, a scene from a movie playing out in her bleak reality. The bikers weren't a threat to her. They were a shield. The man she had shown a moment of simple kindness to was now revealing himself to be a figure of immense power, and he was turning that power toward her defense. The transformation in Mr. Silas was immediate and pathetic. The cruel bravado melted away, replaced by a desperate, fawning terror. "A misunderstanding," he stammered, holding up his clammy hands. "Just a simple business misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work something out. I'll forget the back rent, of course." "No problem at all." Bear looked at him with cold, undisguised contempt. "It's too late for that. You showed your true colors. You prey on the weak. You kick people when they're down. That's not business. That's cowardice." He walked slowly toward Clara, his heavy boots making deliberate, solid sounds on the floor. The other bikers parted for him, their eyes still locked on Silas. When he reached her, he stopped. He looked at her, his expression softening from the hard mask of leadership into something gentler, something filled with a quiet, fierce gratitude. "I can't repay you for what you did," he said, his voice for her alone. "An act like that, it's priceless. But we can make sure you're never in this position again." He reached up and, with a powerful, fluid motion, unzipped his leather cut. The vest was heavy, worn by years of wind and road, imbued with the symbols of his life and his rank. It was more than a piece of clothing. It was his identity, his armor, his flag. He held it for a moment, then gently, reverently, he draped it over Clara's shoulders. It was huge on her small frame, the heavy leather smelling of rain and the open road. It settled on her like a weighted blanket, a tangible shield. "This is our mark," Bear said, his voice rising again for all to hear. "This woman and this diner are under the protection of the Hell's Angels. Anyone who bothers her answers to us. Anyone." The message was unequivocal. It was a declaration of allegiance, a transfer of power. The vest was a crown, a sigil of protection that made her untouchable. The community, which had been silent in her defense, now reacted. Old Henry stood up, a slow smile spreading across his face. He walked to the counter and laid a crisp $50 bill down. "For her," he said, nodding at Clara. "For her trouble inspired." Another customer followed suit. Then another. A small pile of cash began to grow on the counter, a spontaneous offering of guilt and respect. Lily, the young waitress, finally found her courage. She walked right up to Silas, her eyes blazing. "You're a monster," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And you're not welcome here anymore." The bikers didn't need to lay a hand on Silas. His authority had been dismantled, his power rendered meaningless. He was an outcast in his own establishment, his cruelty exposed and judged by a force he could never hope to challenge. The symbolic gesture of the vest was more potent than any physical threat. It had recognized Clara's quiet dignity and, in doing so, had given her a voice, a standing, and an army. The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, efficient change. Silas was never seen again. One of the bikers, a man with a shrewd mind for business who went by the name Deacon, handled the legalities. Within a week, the deed for the building, the diner, and the apartment above was transferred into Clara's name. The mountain of debt that had haunted her for years vanished, paid off by an anonymous benefactor. The bikers didn't just offer protection, they offered a foundation. They descended on the corner spoon not as menacing figures, but as a surprisingly effective construction crew. Mark would have been impressed. They were carpenters, electricians, plumbers, men who worked with their hands with the same focus and intensity they rode their bikes. They tore out the old, cracked linoleum and laid down warm, polished wood. They replaced the flickering fluorescent lights with soft, welcoming fixtures. The torn vinyl booths were reupholstered in a deep, comfortable red. A new, gleaming espresso machine was installed behind the counter. They painted the faded facade a cheerful, sunny yellow, and a new sign was hung above the door, carved from a single piece of oak. It didn't say the corner spoon. It said, in elegant, simple script, Clara's Place. She tried to protest, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of their generosity, but Bear would hear none of it. Honor is a debt, he told her one afternoon. As they sat in a newly finished booth, the smell of fresh paint and sawdust in the air. You paid yours up front. We're just settling the account. The community watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and shame. They saw the bikers, men they would have crossed the street to avoid, working tirelessly to restore not just a building, but a woman's life. Their perception shifted. The fear they once felt was replaced by a grudging respect. People started to stop by not just for coffee, but to offer a helping hand, to drop off a pot of flowers, to simply say hello to Clara, really seeing her for the first time. She was no longer the tired, invisible waitress. She was Clara, the woman who had faced down Mr. Silas, the woman who had earned the unyielding loyalty of the Hells Angels. She managed the renovation with a quiet, steady competence she never knew she possessed. She chose the colors, planned the new menu, and hired Lily back at a wage far better than Gus had ever paid her. Hanging on a special hook behind the brand-new counter, clean and cared for, was Bear's leather vest. She had tried to give it back, but he had insisted she keep it. It belongs here, he'd said. It's a reminder. For everyone, it was a symbol of her new reality, a silent testament to the fact that her world had been remade. Her quiet dignity, once a liability in a harsh world, had become her greatest asset, the currency that had purchased her a future she could never have imagined. Her life, once defined by loss and struggle, was now being rebuilt, board by board, nail by nail, by the most unlikely family imaginable. The grand reopening of Clara's Place was on a crisp Saturday morning. The sun, which had been absent for what felt like an eternity, broke through the clouds, casting a golden light on the diner's fresh yellow paint. There were no banners, no fanfare, just the quiet click of the lock as Clara turned the key and opened the door. But the street was not empty. Lined up on both sides, polished chrome gleaming in the sun, was the entire charter. Dozens of motorcycles stood as a silent honor guard. The bikers themselves were not in formation. They were mingling on the sidewalk, some leaning against their bikes, others talking quietly amongst themselves. They weren't there as an intimidating force. They were there as guests, as family. Bear stood near the door, not in road-worn rags, but in clean jeans and a simple black t-shirt. He held a small, potted orchid in his hands. He smiled at Clara, a real, warm smile that transformed his rugged face. "For the counter," he said, handing it to her. For luck, the townspeople came too. At first, they were hesitant, intimidated by the sheer number of bikers. But they saw old Henry walk right through the line, nodding at the leather-clad men as he passed, and enter the diner to take his usual seat at the counter. They saw Lily, her face bright with confidence, carrying a tray of coffee out to the men on the street. Slowly, the fear gave way to curiosity, and then to a genuine sense of community. Families, couples, the old regulars and new faces, all came to fill the newly refurbished booths. The diner was alive with the buzz of conversation and the clatter of cutlery, sounds that were no longer tinged with desperation but with warmth and camaraderie. Clara moved through the room, a genuine smile gracing her lips. She was no longer a ghost. She was the heart of this place. She poured coffee, took orders, and shared laughter with her customers. She was home. The leather vest hung in its place of honor behind the counter, a silent guardian. Everyone who entered saw it. They understood what it meant. It was a statement that this was a place of decency, a place where kindness was valued, a place under protection. Late in the afternoon, as the lunch rush subsided, Clara stood at the large front window, wiping it clean. She looked out at the scene. The gleaming motorcycles, the bikers talking with the townsfolk, the children who were now cautiously approaching to admire the powerful machines. Her life had been a quiet, solitary struggle. Now it was full. She had found a tribe in the most unexpected of places. The roar of a motorcycle engine was no longer a sound of anonymous threat passing through her town. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of respect. It was the sound of her family, a brotherhood she had earned not with strength or power, but with a simple bowl of soup, an act of compassion that had echoed out into the world and brought back a miracle. The sun began to set, casting long shadows down the street. The bikers started their engines, the familiar thunder rolling through the town once more. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. As they rode off, a single motorcycle remained parked in front of the diner. Bears. He wasn't leaving. He was staying for dinner. Clara turned from the window, a quiet sense of peace settling over her, deep and lasting. Her dignity was secure. Her future was her own. She was home.